Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, as the wind sighs against the glass and the flame trembles low, we invite you into another tale of suspense and candlelight. Let the mystery begin. There are Sundays in the English village that feel as polished and predictable as the silver on the vicar's sideboard, hymns at 11, roast at 1, pudding at past, and a drowsy peace to follow like a shawl laid over the shoulders of the afternoon. On such a Sunday, St Mary Mead gleamed beneath a mild October sky, its lanes brushed by a wind soft as a sigh, and the faintest fragrance of wood smoke curling from cottage chimneys. The church bell had tolled, pew by pew, hats had bobbed out into the sunlight, and the village set, woven of needlework guilds, allotment arguments, and the intrigues of the Women's Institute, drifted homeward to their dinners. At the end of the high street, where ivy clung like a discreet confidant to an old stone wall, Miss Jane Marple paused outside her garden gate. She was not young and never pretended to be. But in the quiet blue of her eyes there was the quickness of a bird who knows which hedges keep secrets. A string bag on one arm, a small posy of late roses in the other, she stood to consider the afternoon. There was talk, there is always talk, that the vicar's wife, Mrs. Grimsby, intended to crown the parish restoration fund with a modest supper in the church hall, a supper elevated to respectability by a pudding spoken of throughout the county, a Sunday pudding darkly golden, buoyed by suet and currants, with a sauce thick as velvet and flecked with citrus. One need not approve of sweet to understand its consolations. Pudding, Miss Marple murmured, a smile grazing her lips. It is extraordinary how many moral dramas arrange themselves around it. Some people cannot resist a second helping. Others cannot resist stirring the pot. She let herself in. The clock in the parlour ticked with a prim insistence, and the photograph of a young man in uniform, her nephew Raymond, at an age when the world seemed eager to be read, watched benignly over the lace mat. As the kettle came to the boil, Miss Marple laid out her tea with the delicate decisiveness that is the hallmark of an orderly mind. She thought of Mrs. Grimsby's lists, so very perfect, of Mr. Harold Pinsent, the solicitor, whose integrity was much admired and whose appetite was subtle in its discriminations, of pretty Lettice Vale, with cheeks like cold apples and an ambition not so much concealed as badly folded, and of Major Whodunit, who had returned to the village with a moustache like a command and an air of grievance nobody could quite locate. A sparrow tapped the window. Such small sounds had messages if one listened. Miss Marple had been listening for a lifetime. By 4 o'clock, the vicarage kitchen was a theatre of bustle. Copper pans gleamed like half-moons. There were the whiskings and siftings and the sensible footsteps of Mrs. Grimsby's maid, Ellen, who had a dimple one side and a melancholy the other. In the centre of the broad table rested the pudding basin itself, swaddled in cloth, its surface sealed and twine-knotted, ready for the gentle insistence of steam. From time to time Mrs. Grimsby lifted the lid of the great pot with a pride at once maternal and devout. If one wished to conclude negotiations for a charitable pledge or soothe the ruffled feathers of choir politics, one did well to do it near that pot. It was at 4:45 that Miss Marple crossed the lane to deliver her roses. She found Mrs. Grimsby flushed but buoyant, Ellen grave but dutiful, and the vicar himself utterly at sea amid the profane arithmetic of chairs and trestle tables. Conversation flowed like cream. Would Major Whodunit sit beside Miss Hartnell, who disapproved of him, or opposite Mrs. Bantry, who did not mind being amused? Should the solicitor say grace, or the curate? And where, for the love of peace, was the fresh jar of nutmeg? On the top shelf, left of the clock, murmured Miss Marple, her eyes hardly appearing to travel. "Oh, Miss Marple, how you always know," laughed Mrs. Grimsby, and up she climbed, tow-coloured hair escaping pins like sunshine resisting clouds. She found the jar, of course. People always do when they are told where to look. One could say the scene was charming. One could say it was safe. But to those who attend to the slight dissonances the note 1 soprano in 6 cannot reach, there was an unease hidden like a seed beneath the loam. It was in the stiffness of Ellen's shoulders when Major Whodunit's name was mentioned. It was in the way Mr. Pinsent's gaze lingered a fraction too long on the pudding basin, as if it were a sealed document awaiting signature. It was in Lettice Vale's laugh, which was a trifle sharper than necessary, when she stopped by with a tin of macaroons and a remark about fortunes that turned like tides without warning. At 6:30, the hall filled with that pleasant roar native to village rooms, the clatter of cups, the exchange of civilities like cards dealt from a well-thumbed deck, the scent of floor polish, lamp oil, and sponge cake. The windows took the violet of evening and held it, and the electric light made islands of faces, pinched, merry, hollowed, bright. Miss Marple, in a chair modestly near the middle, observed with the equanimity of one who knows that sooner or later every pattern declares itself. The pudding was escorted in like a visiting dignitary borne by Ellen and shadowed by Mrs. Grimsby. A hush, a cheer, the ceremonious spoon, the first cloud of fragrant steam, currants shining like small secrets, nutmeg rising like a whisper from an old letter. "Moderation," said the vicar jovially, though he was not a moderate man where pudding was concerned. Plates went round, the sauce poured like benediction, and spoons rose in tremulous devotion. Mr. Pinsent took his first mouthful with the solemnity of a deed. Lettice Vale with the daring of a girl who finds life a trifle underseasoned. Major Whodunit as if pardoning an inferior regiment. Miss Marple tasted as one tastes weather, attentively prepared to note what is usual in order to perceive what is not. It was then, no sooner, no later, that a little shiver passed through the hall. Not a draught. Draughts greet doors and complain under sills. This was a moral shiver, a ripple of attention, as when a congregation recognizes in a sermon a sentence meant for it alone. Ellen had paused. She touched her throat. It might have been the heat. The kitchen had been hot, and she had been faithful to it. Mrs. Grimsby, with a housewife's practicality, murmured something about air and fetched a glass of water. Ellen drank. She smiled her gratitude with the side of her face that possessed the dimple. "Quite all right," she said. "Only the steam." But the pudding on her plate, which she hadn't yet tasted, seemed to regard her with an unnerving innocence. Miss Marple's spoon rested. A thread of thought, fine as silk, drew itself through her mind. She had watched Mrs. Grimsby reach for the nutmeg on the top shelf. She had observed the twine, the neatness of the knot, the way the basin had been turned. She had noticed in the larder a second jar, no, perhaps not a jar, an old spice tin pushed back, with a label that had known more than one hand. "Ellen, dear," said Miss Marple a few minutes later, and the old lady's voice was a hand on a child's shoulder in a crowd. "Do sit a moment. You have done so much." Ellen obeyed. The room recovered its genial noise. Knives chimed softly against plates as seconds were taken, and then, as always happens, with a pudding so very well made that it breaks down resolve as if it were so much sugar, thirds were considered. At 20 minutes to 8, Mr. Harold Pinsent stood to compliment the cook. It is the sort of thing solicitors do, believing, not wrongly, that goodwill is a currency exchanged without taxation. He lifted his glass. He smiled the smile that had closed leases and opened monuments. He said, "Madam," and the word had not finished unfolding when the glass trembled in his hand and fell. He put a hand to his chest, and a curious astonishment, how could this be happening to him in the bright propriety of the church hall, amid suite and song, arranged itself upon his features. Chairs scraped. The vicar cried out. Mrs. Grimsby's face became a blank sheet, and then a rush of writing. Ellen's dimple vanished altogether. Miss Marple did not cry out. She observed. She saw the spoon still wet with sauce. She saw the napkin with a small ochre stain where nutmeg had shifted. She smelt. What did she smell? A shadow beneath the spice, a bitterness that did not belong to the domestic repertoire. She looked at the basin, innocent as a cradle. Then she looked at the people, for puddings do not poison. People do. Outside, the evening pressed close to the glass. The wind, which had been gentle, found a fiercer key. In the hall, the candle set at the centre of the long table, a romantic flourish in an age addicted to switches, wavered as if consulted by an unseen breath. Mr. Pinsent sank quite neatly, like a man who has practised it for a play. A spoon rang against the floor like a bell. We are accustomed to imagine that death arrives with melodrama, with drums, and an interval for rearranging the furniture. But in English villages he is an old acquaintance with whom one suddenly finds oneself seated, unannounced, at supper. He takes what is set before him. He leaves the conversation altered. Miss Marple, who had seen a similar look on a farmhand, once, many years ago, when a bottle under the sink had been mistaken for cider, thought quite calmly that there would be talk of the sauce, that someone would remember the top shelf, that someone would swear the label had not always looked like that, and that, most important of all, someone had. Chapter. The moment between alarm and action is curiously elastic. It seemed to stretch now thin as pulled sugar. As the church hall absorbed the fact that Mr. Harold Pinsent, solicitor, warden of the parish plate, an authority on mortgages and morals, was no longer standing but folded with neatness at the foot of his chair. There was the brisk rallying of the respectable. Someone fetched water that could do no good. Someone loosened a tie that had not been tight. Mrs. Grimsby's hands, capable and good, flitted with an instinct to tidy that comes to Englishwomen in any extremity. The vicar said, "Dear me," with the helplessness of a man who had often seen suffering in print, but seldom at his own table. "Give him air," cried Miss Hartnell. Though there was more air in the world than could be of use, Miss Marple did not cry out or busy herself. She allowed herself the slow, methodical breath of a dressmaker threading a difficult needle. She knelt, not too near, and looked with exactness at what was to be seen, the greyish cast at the lips, the glass overturned, the spoon that lay under the chair, film of sauce still clinging to its bowl, the napkin rucked upon his knee. The eyes were open, but curiously uninquiring, like those of a man who had misread a timetable and resigned himself to waiting. There are looks that suggest the heart, others the lungs, and some that bitter, abrupt collapse that speak of interference more calculating. "Mr. Clement," Miss Marple said, turning her head and addressing the vicar as if she were asking for the hymn number, "would you be so kind as to telephone Dr. Haydock?" "And the police? The police?" Mrs. Grimsby repeated the word as a parishioner might repeat baptism when the baby had not been intended. "The police," said Miss Marple gently. "I fancy we shall require them." A little wind, having bullied the windows, found a chink and came into the hall like a curious cat. Ellen, Mrs. Grimsby's maid, stood very straight at the end of the table. Too straight, Miss Marple thought. It is odd, the way the body will attempt rectitude when the conscience is unsure of its footing. Lettuce veil, all lace collar, and not enough warmth in her coat, had a hand to her mouth in a manner that would have seemed theatrical if her eyes had not looked genuinely too wide for her face. Major Whodunit's moustache bristled into indignation as into battle. He was the sort of man who sees affront in calamity and offers to horsewhip it. And there was Mr. Pinsent, no longer useful, no longer opinionated, his life flung from him with a suddenness that was the worst breach of manners the poor man had ever committed. The vicar went out, stammering apologies to the Almighty as the door flapped behind him. Mrs. Grimsby knelt, as if petitioning the carpet, and whispered Harold's name with the tender authority of a woman accustomed to coaxing puddings and people into their better selves. Ellen, after a moment's stillness, slipped away towards the kitchen. Miss Marple saw her go. "Miss Marple," hissed Miss Hartnell at her elbow, "do you suppose—"
"Oh, but we mustn't suppose."
"It is only his heart, no doubt, what with the excitement and the—" "Suet, perhaps," said Miss Marple. "He was a careful man. One always wonders how such men answer surprise." By the time Dr. Haydock's motor coughed up the lane, there was a hush set like a cloth over the room. The doctor came in with the snug, practised efficiency of a man who knows how to be sensible over people's bodies without quite trampling their dignity. He knelt, touched, listened, and then rocked back on his heels with the sad, annoyed expression of one whose opponent has slipped off the board. He sniffed the spoon. He took up the sauce-boat, lifted it, and set it down. He looked at Miss Marple, and his eyes, which were kind and ironical by turns, had a question in them. "Doctor?"
asked Mrs. Grimsby. "Gone," said Dr. Haydock, not unkindly. "I'm very sorry, his heart,"
suggested Major Whodunit in the tone of best practice. Dr. Haydock glanced again at the spoon, at the sauce in its silver boat, at the napkin with its ochre smudge. He had the country doctor's reluctance to name the unpalatable within hearing of the Women's Institute, and yet one must be honest. "Perhaps," he said.
"Perhaps not."
"We shall see." He looked towards the door where the vicar had disappeared. As if conjured, the vicar reappeared, colourless but resolute. "Inspector Slack is on his way from Much Benham," said Mr. Clement, and I telephoned the bishop. I thought it proper." "The police will suffice," said Dr. Haydock dryly. In the small hiatus before the official world descended, Miss Marple's light steps took her not to the kitchen, but to the larder. If Dr. Haydock noticed, he did not object. The larder was orderly. It had been Mrs. Grimsby's pride before it was her necessity. On the shelf, the nutmeg jar sat primly where Miss Marple had seen it placed. Next to it, pushed back as if shy of being seen, was the little spice tin she had noticed before. She did not touch it. One does not disturb a still life when one's true interest is to catch the painter's hand. Ellen was there, washing something with such vigour that more harm than cleanliness might ensue. Her hands, red at the knuckles from a lifetime of water too cold and work too hot, gripped the dishcloth as if it were a thought she could wring into sense. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, and the dimple attempted to reassert itself and failed. "Poor Mr. Pinsent," she said, as if the words belonged to someone else.
"He was always generous with the raffle." "Yes," said Miss Marple.
"And generous in advice, I believe. There is a kind of generosity that costs one very little and yet is highly esteemed." Ellen blinked.
I'm to make tea for the ladies," Mrs. Grimsby said.
"Tea is what we do." "Quite right," said Miss Marple. "Do you know, my dear, the world has been retrieved from worse abysses by an unexpected cup of tea. Would you be so good as to bring the nutmeg here a moment?"
"The nutmeg? I used—"
Ellen faltered.
"I'll fetch it, miss." She turned, reached to the top shelf.
Her fingers touched the jar, hesitated, and in that infinitesimal pause, the smallest of delays, the size of a scruple, Miss Marple, who has made a study of pauses, saw that the girl had thought of reaching for the tin and changed her mind. The jar came down. It was heavy with its proper spice, which, when Miss Marple loosened the lid, released that warm, dry perfume that belongs to nursery puddings and good housekeeping manuals. "No betrayal there, not on the surface." "Thank you," said Miss Marple, and returned it. She did not glance at the tin. The tin, feeling itself unregarded, remained eloquent. In the hall, Inspector Slack arrived with a flourish of practical contempt for everyone present. He had the air of a man unfairly requisitioned from more important crimes, though of these he had quite enough, and he looked upon village catastrophes as upon a calf with a broken leg, regrettable,
messy, and requiring to be dealt with briskly lest the day be wasted.
He nodded to Dr. Haydock, bowed provisionally at Mrs. Grimsby, and consulted Miss Marple with the lack of warmth of a man obliged to acknowledge a person he cannot depreciate in public. "Well then," he said, "a death at the parish supper. Not the thing, I'm sure." He went to the body, bent, and sniffed in the rough and ready manner of a man who trusts his nose as much as any laboratory. His face underwent a small shift.
"Huh," he said.
"You'd know that anywhere." Dr. Haydock glanced meaningfully at the sauce-boat.
"Perhaps not in front of—" Yes, grunted Slack, who was not unkind but was ill at ease with discretion.
He straightened. "Right. No one is to leave the hall. Mrs. Grimsby, if you please, the kitchen door to be kept shut, and any items there not to be disturbed. Reverend, you'll permit me? Thank you. Mr. Pinsent's plate and spoon are not to be touched. Whoever was serving the pudding and the sauce, come forward." Ellen stepped out and tucked her hands under her apron as if to confiscate them. Mrs. Grimsby stood beside her, the picture of respectable despair. "I served the pudding, Inspector," she said, "and Ellen the sauce. It is a thing we have done 100 times." Slack nodded as if noting down a physiological fact, such as that people possess lungs.
"And who had seconds, thirds?"
"I shall want to know. And likewise if anyone refused." There was a general stirring as the village, uneasy at being turned into data, attempted to recall its appetites with accuracy. The vicar owned up to second helpings with the gallant penitence of a man who considers gluttony a venial sin if prettily confessed. Miss Hartnell claimed to have contented herself with one and a small spoonful more only to be sociable. Lettice, when the inspector's gaze fixed upon her, said brightly, "Oh, I had only the sauce. I don't much care for pudding, so provincial of me, and then I thought better and tried a little," her hands shaping tiny quantities that were belied by the plate's smear. "And Mr. Pinsent?"
asked Slack. "First help," said Ellen, almost in a whisper.
And then just before he stood up, I offered a trifle more sauce. He smiled. He had a kind way.
I poured. The words seemed to heap upon themselves.
"Not much."
"A little." Slack turned the sauce-boat in his hand without tilting it, like a man weighing a small animal.
"Dr. Haydock?" Haydock's mouth was grim. "Smells to me very much like prussic acid," he said at last, in a voice that left no room for coziness. "Hydrocyanic."
"You know the odour."
"Bitter almonds." A rustle went through the women like a gust in poplars. Miss Marple's hands folded neatly upon her lap, the better to prevent them from making even so much theatre as a flutter. How could that be in my kitchen?" Mrs. Grimsby whispered, and it was no affectation now. She had gone white to the lips. "Inspector, I have never—" Miss Marple looked down at her own hands as if they were an old story in which one always forgets a minor character. Something small and bright was slipping between lines, she thought.
"One always notices how people remember what they did right. It is an admirable habit, and an unfortunate one for murderers. Mr. Pinsent?" said Slack, turning to the room at large. "Was he known to have enemies?"
"Grievances? Did he smell of a lawsuit?" There was a murmur of deprecating Englishness at the vulgarity of the word enemy, but then the facts of life reasserted themselves. Mr. Pinsent had been, it seemed, a man upon whom many had depended and few had loved. He administered trust funds and admonitions, and he was not considered immune to the impulse to remind one of the favour thus bestowed. Major Goodenough, whose temper was not always a parade-ground model, had had words with him in the Blue Boar a fortnight past. Over a bill, or over a boundary, nobody could be exact, and there had been, allegedly, raised voices and the phrase damned impertinence from one or other party. Lettice Vale, who had ambitions that looked prettier than they were, had been observed in Mr. Pinsent's office more than was strictly necessary for the sale of a few shares. There was talk of a legacy that had unaccountably shrunk between rumour and reality. Mrs. Grimsby, whose accounts for the Restoration Fund were a point of pride, had been irked, she confessed it, by Mr. Pinsent's brisk refusal to open a separate account and his insistence that all cheques pass through his firm. "Only for convenience," he had said, which is a phrase that sets a housewife's teeth on edge. "And Ellen?" Slack's tone was not unkind, but it was blunt.
"Any connection?"
Ellen, who had returned with a tray because tea must be made even for policemen, coloured. "No, sir," she said. "Only that Mr. Pinsent once. Only that he spoke kind-like to me in the lane when my brother was out of work. He said perhaps there was a place at the offices for a boy handy with his letters, but it came to nothing after. Did you feel aggrieved?"
asked Slack, with the patience of a man trying to force a cork. "No."
"Sir," said Ellen, and it had the sound of truth, for she had known too many disappointments to be moved to grievance by so small a one. Dr. Haydock, having completed such preliminary examination as dignity permitted in a church hall, rose and brushed at his knees. "You will wish to take the body," he said. "I should like to make certain. And, Slack, that sauce is not to be tasted by anything that lives." "It won't be," said Slack. He looked at the sauce-boat with a mingled contempt and respect one reserves for snakes. "All right, then."
"No one to leave."
"I'll want full names and addresses." His gaze halted, as perhaps it always did, upon Miss Marple. "And you, madam, you will have noticed something or other I shall wish to hear." Miss Marple smiled, a small, middle-distance smile. "Oh, Inspector, I notice so very many things. It would be arrogant to suppose I know which of them are useful." "It would," said Slack sombrely, "and yet you invariably do." He turned away before gratitude could make him ill. It is curious how, once the first thunderclap is gone, the old habits assert themselves. People, in low tones, made space for tea. Someone put another log on the fire. Someone else, with the black humour of a people who endured wars and winter, said he did enjoy his pudding, and was shushed into righteousness. Miss Marple sipped tea that tasted of soap and sympathy and let her mind go about its housework. A death is to be dealt with first. The arrangement of motives can be done while the water boils. Major Whodunit presented himself to Slack as a soldier presents himself to an unnecessary superior. "Look here," he said, "you'll be wanting to know I had words with Pinsent."
"Over my property."
"He wanted certain papers."
"I told him he'd have them when I'd done with them."
"Damn it, excuse me, Miss Marple, darn it, one expects a fellow to allow a gentleman his own time." "And what papers were those?"
asked Slack. "Title deeds."
"A small parcel of land abutting the lane."
"Valuable to me, less valuable to him, I dare say, except he had a notion of some infernal improvement scheme with the county council." The Major's moustache bristled like a hedge in wind.
"He hinted, do you know, that if I did not find it convenient to comply, he could make life awkward. The fellow had no business to be so dashed municipal." "Thank you," said Slack. "Very helpful." Lettice Vale, when it came her turn, laughed as a girl laughs when asked if she has eaten the jam. "I saw Mr. Pinsent because I wanted advice, naturally," she said. "One always does."
"But I found him. Oh, so unromantic about money."
He said prudent a great deal. "I prefer lucky. He told me," and here her eyes glinted, "that I should not expect fortunes from distant aunts I had neglected. It was impertinent of him to know I had neglected them." "And did you?" asked Miss Marple softly. Lettice turned, surprised. The old lady's voice always surprised because it seemed so harmless. "Yes," she said, with candour that had more charm than merit. "They were dull." One cannot be expected to pour tea for dullness all one's life. She dropped her eyes to the smear of sauce on her plate and made a face as if at a misapplied lipstick. "How horrid," she murmured, and shivered prettily. Mrs. Grimsby's hands, set now in her lap, twined and untwined like anxious ivy. "Inspector," she said, "the Restoration Fund, it is quite proper. My accounts are in order." Mr. Pinsent was only helping with the banking until the trustees met.
"I should not like there to be any whispering."
"The church roof leaks without whispers as it is." "No doubt," said Slack with an unpleasantly neutral tone. "We shall examine the accounts. As a matter of routine, the routine would be thorough. St Mary Mead had the honour and inconvenience of being the inspector's favourite village for finding what people would rather not have found. Miss Marple waited until the obvious questions had been asked, and the equally obvious answers laid out like cutlery. Then, in a pocket of quiet, she approached the end of the table and examined, with that seeming vagueness that in old ladies is so often camouflage, the spoons set near the sauce-boat. One had an infinitesimal darkening at the rim, a sort of bruised look, as if some liquid had kissed it and withdrawn. She looked to see how the sauce had been poured, whether Ellen had tilted the boat as a careful girl does, using the lip to control the ribbon, or slopped it as a tired one may. It was a neat girl's work. "You observed something, Miss Marple?" Dr. Haydock had come to her side in that conspiratorial fashion physicians have with clever old women. "Only that wickedness, like virtue, often loves an economy," said Miss Marple. "It is easier to add than to adulterate. One might put a thing in a sauce at the very moment it is on a spoon, rather than waste the whole boat, especially if one had practiced the movement, in stirring, perhaps, or in adding a little extra cream for kindness' sake." "Who practiced it?" asked Haydock. Miss Marple's eyes rested for a moment on Ellen's careful hands, then shifted to the smaller hands of Lettice Vale, and then to Mrs. Grimsby's competent, mothersome ones. "Many women know how to pour," she said. "The question is who has the nerve to pour wickedness. That, dear doctor, is not a kitchen skill." Inspector Slack returned from the larder, carrying the small tin in a piece of clean cloth, with the air of a man not wishing to be contaminated by a label. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said grudgingly. "Tin labelled mace in a miserable scrawl.
"And smelling, well, it's the same."
We'll have the lab make noises I can put in a report, but my old conch tells me enough." He looked at the assembly.
"This was no accident."
"Someone put a poison where it would reach a particular man."
"It did. We'll find who, and they'll hang for it. There was that."
A collective drawing in of breath, the sound English villagers make when the gallows, kept carefully in the cupboard of the mind since the last assizes, is abruptly brought out and dusted. They looked, some at their plates, some at the door, some at the floor, where Mr. Pinsent no longer was. Miss Marple looked at the candle in the middle of the table, its flame little moved by the draught. Steady, dutiful. She thought of a farmhand and a bottle beneath the sink. She thought of labels and who writes them, and of promises made in lanes that come to nothing, and of a girl who laughs at dull aunts and expects luck to do the heavy lifting of life. "Very well," Slack concluded. "We proceed, names, statements, then home, each to their house.
And mind you, no talking in lanes."
"You'll talk to me. You won't talk among yourselves."
"Murder fattens on gossip. He might as well have told the wind to rest."
In St Mary Mead, talk was the element in which all things either drowned or learned to swim. Miss Marple rose. Her knees complained mildly, as honest knees will, but she ignored them. "Inspector," she said, "if I may be permitted a little speculation, no more than the sort of thought one has when knitting." Slack groaned. "It occurs to me that Mr. Pinsent stood up to speak, and only then failed. If a hand wished to make certain of him, that hand would have been alert to the moment when he was distracted by his own importance. The paw would have been very small and very sure." "And whose hand?" said Slack out of habit, as if she kept a ledger of hands.
"Oh, I am certain," said Miss Marple. with a mildness that was almost mischievous.
"That by the time we have all said our prayers and drunk our tea, St Mary Mead will have identified, wrongly, of course, 3 or 4 people who could have done it. It is my experience that the truth lies seldom in the first dish we serve to ourselves. One must wait for the second helping." Outside, the evening had grown thick and intimate. The ivy pressed its cold cheek to the window. Somewhere in the lane a bicycle bell rang twice, a village sound, prompt with errands. The candle's flame, consulted by no one, kept its steady, indifferent pact with the wick. Mr. Harold Pinsent's chair stood empty. It would not be filled again. The vacancy, like all true vacancies, demanded accounting. "Come, Jane," said Dr. Haydock softly, not to direct her, but to keep her from pursuing thought so far into abstraction that she might forget her shawl. "We will give our statements and go home. You will knit, and I will write a note that says nothing of what I think. Tomorrow Slack will be officious. The day after that he will be unpleasant.
And somewhere in between, you will remember something small that will enlarge itself like one of those ridiculous sponge creatures children pop in water." Miss Marple smiled up at him,
Dutifully reached for her shawl, and gave her statement with the cheerful clarity of one with nothing to hide and much to reveal.
at the right time, in the right fashion.
Her eyes, meanwhile, were upon Ellen's careful hands, upon Lettice's quick ones, upon Mrs. Grimsby's hands, that trembled when they knew themselves observed, and grew capable when they did not. She was thinking, as she often had, that most crimes are moral housekeeping gone wrong. Outside, the wind lifted a little. It made the signboard of the Blue Boar creak and complain. It fretted the edge of a notice pinned on the church door. Restoration Fund Supper, all welcome. Beneath which some unkind pen, earlier in the week, had scrawled, "and all pay." Someone had crossed it out in a fury of righteousness. The cross-out was the most eloquent line. Miss Marple took her gloves from her pocket. She drew them on with careful snugness. She felt, in the right-hand glove, the unevenness of a darn, done years ago by another old lady who had taught her that economies have a history. Then, with that small, brisk nod with which she used to set her school-children copying neat rows of letters, she prepared herself to do again what she did best, to see, in the ordinary, the one thread that does not belong. To tug it, to watch what unravels. The village stirred, adjusted shawls, fetched coats, stood in little groups saying the things one says when saying anything else would be too honest. The inspector, with the inevitability of a pendulum, swung between politeness and impatience. Dr. Haydock pocketed his stethoscope like a man putting away a violin after an unsuccessful performance, and Miss Marple, with the gentlest of looks that promised nothing and forgave much, stepped into the lane. Chapter 2. Morning. In St Mary, Mead has a way of making last night's talk feel extravagant. The autumn sun stooped through mist, and hedges wore cobweb lace, beads strung like the necklaces girls save for dances. The church bell, with a species of innocence one doubts bells possess, announced matins as if no scandal had ever touched its rope. But scandal, like smoke, finds the cracks. Curtains twitched. The milkman received 3 times his usual number of questions, and 10 times the advice. Miss Marple took her tea at the window, a habit of years. She enjoyed the quiet warfare of sparrows and the economy of a village coming to. It is well, when one intends to examine one's neighbours, to begin with a soft gaze. The hard one may be saved for later. By 9:30, Inspector Slack had called, brisk, hat brim low, his notebook an instrument of percussion. "Doctor confirms," he said without ceremony at the gate. "Hydrocyanic acid. Enough in that sauce to kill a regiment if you warmed it." But it wasn't warmed wholesale. Someone administered a little, neat as a lace edge, at the point of service. "We found the tin in the larder, like you said. Traces consistent. Now then, placements. You've a map in your head, Miss Marple. Kindly put it in mine. Miss Marple, who disliked being useful to authority, and yet could not quite resist the tidy feeling of putting facts in their boxes, invited him into the parlour. On a sheet of clean paper, she drew the church hall as simply as a schoolroom exercise: door, trestle tables, dais, stove, and the long central table where the pudding had been paraded. With neat dots she marked seats. "Here," she said, "Mr. Pinsent, head of the middle table. To his right, Major Whodunit. To his left, Miss Hartnell. Opposite, Lettice Vale." Mrs. Grimsby and Ellen moved between kitchen and table from this side passage. See? And the sauce boat stood here at the near end, nearer Ellen's hand. The vicar at the far end, naturally, for toasts. The windows along here. The pudding basin, this stand. Slack watched the pencil dance with reluctant appreciation.
And when did Pinsent rise?
After his first helping, when many had had seconds. Ellen, she is deft, offered him just a ribbon, as I heard her say, of sauce, with that small laugh girls give when they flatter someone without meaning to. He smiled. He was fond of being attended to. He sat, then rose to speak, glass in hand, and fell. "So if the poison was put neat into his spoon," Slack said, "it was done either when Ellen poured, or by someone immediately after with a drop from a phial or such. Quick as you like?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Quick and sure, and practised." Slack made a note like a slap.
"Ellen," he muttered.
"Or someone who could intercept the pour. Mrs. Grimsby was near enough." "Mrs. Grimsby is a very good woman," said Miss Marple gently. "Good women are perfectly capable of murder, Inspector, but they seldom do it for themselves." Slack shot her a look both irritated and amused. "You're a comfort, you are." "They say so at the Mothers' Union," said Miss Marple placidly. "Do try a scone," he refused, perhaps from policy. Policy in Slack often disguised appetite. He rose. "We'll reconstruct the taking of the sauce," he said, "and we'll look into this Restoration Fund banking business. Pinsent had fingers everywhere.
Lot of offended parties.
Too many motives and only one corpse. Untidy arithmetic. You'll come up to the hall?" "I shall be there," said Miss Marple. The church hall by daylight was a place of scuffed floors and honest scrub. The candles had long since been pinched, but a thin beam of sun fell from the high west window, laying a stripe across the table like a ruler. Mrs. Grimsby, pale but efficient, was setting cups for the women who would inevitably descend to set the wrong things right.
Ellen, eyes pink from a night of unreasonable tears, was polishing the sauce boat as if its reflective surface might offer absolution. "Leave that," Slack said, not unkindly.
"We'll want it as it was. It is."
"As it was," Ellen murmured, laying it down.
"I didn't dare touch it proper." The dimple made a brave attempt. "Good," said Slack. "Now, Mrs. Grimsby, walk it for me." He took up a battered spoon.
"You carve no scoop the pudding, place to the plate."
Ellen follows with the sauce. "Where were you standing? Here?" "Show me the angle." Mrs. Grimsby obeyed, hands trembling only at the start. Habit soon steadied them. "Pudding here, Inspector."
Ellen a step behind and to the left.
We made our way round, ladies first, then the gentlemen. Oh, forgive me, that is my private rule. And then we returned with seconds to those who asked. When Mr. Pinsent had finished his first plate, Ellen offered sauce, a grace, really, for appearances. He held his spoon like this. She mimed, the hand tilt exact. And Ellen tipped just so. Ellen, suddenly, with the earnestness of the accused, reached for the boat and made the motion, small wrist obedient to old training. The ribbon fell, imaginary, thank God, precisely into the bowl of the invisible spoon and would have broken into the leftover sheen had it been real. "It is a practised movement," Miss Marple observed.
"Very pretty." Ellen flushed, as if praised for a thing that now seemed dirty. Slack's eyes sharpened.
"To add anything into that pour, you'd need a finger free, and the thing to add in your palm or sleeve.
You'd need nerve."
You'd need an instant when no one watched. Busy room. but people look away when the predictable happens. They looked away for the toast, Clement standing, Pinson rising, opportunity. Miss Hartnell arrived like a moral draught, brisk and officious. "If there is to be reconstruction," she announced, "you will require witnesses who are not the perpetrators. I am entirely at liberty." She eyed Ellen with a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "Quite," said Slack dryly. "Stand where you were, Miss Hartnell. Good. Now, did you observe anyone approach Mr. Pinson just before he rose?"
"Anyone pass behind him?"
Miss Hartnell sniffed. "Only Letty's veil fluttering like a moth. She is the sort of girl who leans where she ought to sit and sits where she ought to stand. She asked Mr. Pinson whether she might propose a vote of thanks for the pudding. Impertinent, as it was not her place. He told her, 'After me, my dear,' and laughed. She laughed also, though I did not consider it a laughing matter." "Did she touch the sauce boat?"
asked Slack. "No, she touched Mr. Pinson's sleeve. Twice. Twice?"
"Once when she begged and once when she thanked. The girl is prodigal with touches." Miss Hartnell arranged her mouth as if tasting lemon. Miss Marple filed this gently. Young women who had learned to prosper by light fingertip were not an undiscovered species. Lettice herself appeared presently, in a hat too smart for a village morning, a scarf too thin for the weather. "I felt it was my duty," she said, bright as a bell, "to be useful."
"I can tell you everything. I adore helping the police."
"Few people do," said Slack. "Where were you a quarter hour before Pinson rose?" "In the passage? No, in the kitchen. I carried in plates to be an angel. Then I came back to the table because I felt it was showy to be an angel too long. I was opposite Mr. Pinsent when he stood."
"I did put my hand on his sleeve. I always do. Oh, that sounds dreadful. I mean, I can't help touching things when I feel, oh dear." "When you want something," Miss Marple supplied kindly. Lettice coloured, then laughed at herself. "Yes, when I want something."
I wanted him to say a word about the Restoration Fund. I think public gratitude is good form.
"He said he would. Then he was, oh, you didn't pour sauce." Slack cut in. "I loathe sauce," said Lettice with spirit.
It is the sort of thing that gets on one's gloves." Miss Marple glanced at the gloves. Good kid, no stains she could see. But gloves had a way of being taken off just when it mattered and put back on when it did not. "And your hat pin, my dear?" she asked conversationally.
"I observe you have gone pinless today." Lettice's eyes widened with admiration.
"How you see."
"I lost the little mother-of-pearl head last night in the crush. I must look for it."
"It is probably under someone's chair, clutching at the floor like a drowning person." "Poor little thing." "Poor little things have sharp ends," Miss Marple murmured. Major Whodunit stamped in on that, bringing the smell of tobacco and cold. He saluted Miss Marple from the habitual reflex of a man who salutes ladies as he might salute regimental colours. "Inspector," he grunted.
"I've nothing to add. I saw nothing, I did nothing, I know nothing, and I ate too much pudding, which I regret in principle and not in practice."
"What's wanted is a search of Pinsent's office. The fellow was a spider. You'll find plenty knotted in his webs." "Thank you, Major," said Slack. "We shall. Meanwhile, you will kindly place on record where you were between 4 and 5 yesterday afternoon." "In my shed," said the Major with dignity, "sharpening tools and cursing modern gardening twine, which breaks under inspection." "Anyone see you?" Slack asked, all blandness. "Only God," the Major returned tartly. "And he is not called as a witness in these pagan days." Slack twitched a lip. "We'll ask your housekeeper whether you swore at the twine loud enough to be heard."
"As for the office, yes."
"We've sealed it. Clark's a way-face boy. Says Mr. Pinson kept a locked drawer only he touched." "Of course he did," murmured Miss Marple. "Men of order often keep one thing disorderly." "They consider it a recreation," Slack's glance said. "And what do old ladies keep?" "We'll also talk to Hargreaves at the ironmongery about that consignment of chemist's odds," he said, "and how an empty tin labelled mace came to smell like anything but. It wants tracing." "Do," said Miss Marple. "And while you are about it, ask whose handwriting labelled it. Men label like soldiers." Women label like housekeepers. Clerks label like schoolmasters.
One learns to tell, Slack grunted.
It was as close to praise as he got before luncheon. By noon, Miss Marple had made 2 small calls of her own. The first was on Mr. Hargreaves, who owned an ironmongery so tidy it looked as if it would cut you if you glanced sideways. He had the mild astonishment of a man whom trouble seldom seeks and who is affronted to be sought now, a lot of old tins, he said when Miss Marple asked.
Aye, we took a mixed lot last spring, estate clearance from the old chemist's widow over at Much Benham.
Empty, mind you. Rinsed by the undertaker's lad, so he said, and dried. Mrs. Grimsby had 2, I mind. Paid 2p apiece and was fair pleased. And the labels? Miss Marple inquired, peering with maiden-aunt innocence at a tray of brass screws. Some had 'em, some didn't. My Margaret stuck on new where needed. Her hands neat, you can see. He nodded at a shelf where tack nails was written with modest pride. But no one here wrote Mace for the vicarage. Those were already marked. Already marked, Miss Marple repeated softly.
How useful. And dangerous, it seems, Mr. Hargreaves added, dismayed at the thought that something from his shop had entered a tragedy.
You'll tell Inspector I said we rinsed. Well, the lad rinsed, and it's not my fault if old chemists' tins keep ghosts. I shall tell him exactly what you have told me, said Miss Marple, which would be true in spirit if economical in substance. Her second call was shorter. A word with Mrs. Price Ridley at her gate, whose tongue was reputed to be the most agile servant of Satan between 3 parishes, and a pause to pat a small dog that knew secrets and told none. From Mrs. Price Ridley, one learns what people deny. From small dogs, one learns how to listen. Returning by the lane behind the hall, Miss Marple met Ellen, who was carrying the emptied ashpan with the grim cheerfulness of a girl who refuses to be broken by the necessities of stoves. Up close, the maid's youth was more apparent, the soft baby hair at the temple that refuses to be sleek, the rawness along the knuckle where skin resists winter. "You are good to work," Miss Marple said.
Falling into step. If I stop, I cry, Ellen said, without artifice.
And if I cry, Mrs. Grimsby cries, which is a shame, for she has less right than me to give way, seeing she has the house to mind and the reverend to keep from putting coal on the fire wrong. A heavy cross, the clergy, Miss Marple murmured. My dear, did Mr. Pinsent ever speak to you privately beyond that kindness in the lane? Ellen startled, nearly spilling ash.
No, miss. Only good day like a gentleman. If he looked.
He was, men look at you when you carry plates.
It makes no matter. I did nothing wrong. I do not suppose you did, said Miss Marple.
And because Ellen needed something ordinary to do, she took from her reticule a tiny sewing kit and deftly pinched a loose button back upon the girl's cuff.
There! One must keep small things from falling off when larger things have no intention of staying on. Ellen absurdly smiled. Thank you, miss. One more little thing, Miss Marple added, as if recalling something trivial.
When the nutmeg was used yesterday, did Mrs. Grimsby grate it directly into the sauce? Yes, miss, Ellen said. Over the pan, as always. She says bottled spice is a sin. The jar was on the shelf. I fetched it, and she took it from me.
Oh, Ellen frowned. Only, Miss Marple, when I first reached, I put my hand to the little tin. Silly, isn't it?
For the jar sits behind it sometimes. But I saw it was wrong and took the jar.
I'd never have... Of course not, said Miss Marple kindly.
It is interesting, all the same, how the hand goes where the habit is. One must ask where habits come from. Ellen looked troubled, as if suspected not of crime, but of the far deeper failing of being a creature of reflex. Inspector Slack, that afternoon, looked tired of his own thoroughness. Office yields grist, he reported at Miss Marple's gate, like a farmer confessing a glut. Letters. One from the County Council Ytsarts, proposed purchase of a strip of Major Whodunit's land for road widening. Major was obstructive, in the way of men who think ditches are sacred. Another, 2, in fact, from a Miss L. Vale, all curlicues and carelessness, pressing for the early release of a small legacy contrary to the terms, Pinsent had refused quite properly, and memoranda re. the Restoration Fund banking, Mrs. Grimsby pressed the fellow to segregate the fund. He dragged his feet, lazy rather than villainous. No hint of pocketing. Also, Slack allowed himself a thin smile, list of clients' safe deposit keys in a sealed envelope. One key missing.
Guess whose?
Lettuce Vale's? Miss Marple asked, polite as tea. No, Mrs. Grimsby's. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Oh, poor soul. Poor souls can be light-fingered, Slack said. But I'll not hang a woman for mislaying a key when her vicar drowns in papers. We'll see. And the label?
On the tin?
Miss Marple prompted. Slack grimaced. Not the ironmonger girl's neat hand. Not Mrs. Grimsby's generous schoolroom hand either. A crabbed, precise script could be a clerk trained to copperplate and soured by it. Young Pinsent's boy, what is he, Sims, says he never wrote labels. Mr. P despised labels. Says the widow chemist kept old stock boxed with the names altered by a nephew who fancied himself helpful. That nephew's abroad. How inconvenient of him, said Miss Marple. Abroad is such an unhelpful place. Slack snapped his notebook shut. Tonight we'll interview again. I have a mind to bait a small trap, cup of tea style. See who refuses what. You'll keep out of the way. I shall sit in a corner and knit, said Miss Marple. People do not confess to knitting.
They confess to themselves in front of it. He gave her a look almost grateful. Do that. Evening fell as if the village had closed its eyes.
The church hall lamps made their puddles of light on parquet that remembered too many steps. Slack had arrayed his chairs as if for an amateur dramatics meeting. Mrs. Grimsby sat straight, fingers making lace of a handkerchief. Lettuce lounged with defiant grace. Major Whodunit stood, because men who fear being questioned prefer not to sit. Ellen poured tea with hands that had steadied into competence, and Miss Marple, installed by the radiator, brought forth from her bag a length of dove-grey wool. Slack's questions were bland pudding, the same for each, ladled in equal scoops.
Where were you?
Who saw you? Who disliked Mr. Pinsent? Do you take sugar? Do you like bitter almonds? That last, delivered with a smile that made the question ridiculous, caught more than it should. Lettuce laughed, showing teeth. Bitter anything is sophisticated, she said. I adore a slight bitterness. It makes one feel grown. Quite, said Slack, pencil idle. And you, Major? Hate almonds in any form, the Major retorted. Namby-pamby foreign stuff. Mrs. Grimsby? I take what is set before me, she said, voice steady with parish authority.
Ellen? I never liked almond scent, Ellen said, surprising herself into candour. It reminds me of the undertaker's. He was my uncle. Slack's brow moved imperceptibly. Miss Marple's needles clicked as if the wool knew the pattern, and the hands merely attended.
When the tea was done, and nothing more could be extracted by homicide ladled as hospitality, Slack let them go in 2s and 3s. Miss Marple waited. It is a great art to be the last to leave and not be observed doing it. She bent to pick up. A fallen glove, lettuces as dainty as the girl's pretensions, and saw, under the chair opposite Mr. Pinsent's last place, a tiny glint, a mother-of-pearl disc no bigger than a fingernail. She lifted it between forefinger and thumb. A hat-pin head, pretty, pale, and very sharp, where the stem had snapped. Ah, said Miss Marple, softly to herself, the candlelight of thought warming her eyes. Poor little thing. At home, later, she set the trifle upon her saucer and touched, just touched, the broken stem's end to her tongue as a wise child tests winter metal. No taste, of course there would be none now, but she did not need taste. She needed the story of a girl who fluttered and touched sleeves and hated sauce upon gloves, a story of a practised paw and a label badly written, a story of a woman good enough to be used. She laid the pin head down. The room tasted of tea and old lavender. The lamplight made a small, brave circle on familiar things. Miss Marple's thoughts, like moths, went to it and then away. Outside, the wind dropped. The garden accepted the night without complaint. The village, however, did not. It dreamt behind its doors and tattled in its sleep. Chapter 3. The following morning broke with that particular brightness English villages reserve for dark occasions. The frost had been sharp, silvering the hedgerows, and the chimneys of St Mary Mead sent up threads of smoke as if the whole village were quietly thinking. But beneath the calm surface, thought had teeth. By 9 o'clock, everyone knew that Mr. Harold Pinsent had been poisoned, that prussic acid was to blame, and that suspicion, like a misplaced hat, sat awkwardly on several heads. Gossip had already performed its autopsy. Ellen, the maid, was poor and thus dangerous. Mrs. Grimsby was nervous and thus untrustworthy. Lettice Vale was pretty and thus corruptible. And Major Goodenough was a man of temper, which in village logic meant guilt with good manners. Miss Marple, however, sat by her fire, knitting a soft grey
wool scarf that would later, quite coincidentally, fit Dr.
Haydock's coat. She listened to the wireless until the news gave way to the organ music of the 9 o'clock service, and then she turned it off. Some truths she had long known could only be heard in silence. Dr. Haydock arrived unannounced, brisk and disgruntled. "The whole village is running a post-mortem," he said. "Half of them think Ellen did it, the other half are sure the Major did, and Mrs. Price Ridley has suggested you did." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Ah, but dear Mrs. Price Ridley's opinions are like her garden, overgrown, and most of them poisonous." Haydock grinned despite himself. "Slack's in a fine temper. He's found that Pinsent was involved in a nasty piece of business about a small inheritance. Something about a forged codicil that went astray." "Lettice Vale?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild as tea. The doctor's eyebrows rose. "You have a nose for other people's ledgers." "It is rarely other people's ledgers," said Miss Marple. "Just the same moral arithmetic repeated with new names." He sat, stretched long legs toward the fire, and looked at her over clasped hands. "Do you think Ellen did it?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, she is a servant in the old sense, proud, simple, loyal to whoever is kind. She might take blame, but not a life." "Then who?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "There are those who kill for money, and those who kill for shame. I think this was neither." Haydock frowned. "Then what?" She smiled, that small, bird-like smile that promised little and delivered much. "For pride. And pride, Doctor, is often found in respectable cupboards." By afternoon, Inspector Slack had exhausted his patience and nearly his pencils. The statements contradicted neatly, like witnesses in a play. Lettice swore she had touched Mr. Pinsent's sleeve, but nothing more. Major Goodenough denied seeing her hand near the spoon. Mrs. Grimsby insisted she had seen Ellen serve the sauce cleanly. Ellen wept that she had done nothing wrong. Slack spread his notes across the church vestry table and addressed Miss Marple, who had arrived ostensibly to deliver altar flowers. "You wanted to know who labelled the tin. I've sent it to handwriting experts in Melchester. But I'll tell you what worried." She reached into her pocket and placed the small, broken hatpin upon the table.
"Found under Lettice Vale's chair." Haydock whistled softly. "The head is mother of pearl, the stem steel, hollowed at the tip.
"Quite enough to hold a drop of liquid."
A sentimental keepsake until filled with something less innocent."
"Miss Vale may despise sauce, but she has no objection to theatre."
"A touch on a sleeve A careless lean, one could easily let fall a single droplet into a waiting spoon. Slack's eyes hardened.
"You're saying that she had the motive, the manner, and the vanity," Miss Marple said. "She wanted money and thought Pinsent had cheated her. She told herself it was justice, the kind that smells faintly of almonds." They found Lettice that night at her cottage, staring into a mirror with a fascination that was almost pity. When Slack entered, she turned with a slow, rueful smile. "I suppose Miss Marple told you," she said simply. "She always does." He nodded grimly. "I didn't mean to kill him," Lettice said, voice thin.
"Just to frighten him. I thought a drop would make him ill, show him I could ruin him as he ruined me. But he toasted the village and Her breath caught.
"He was such a dull man to die for." Miss Marple stepped forward, her face grave. "My dear, dull men are the ruin of far livelier souls than yours." Lettice's laugh broke on a sob.
"It's silly, isn't it? I thought it would be dramatic."
"But it was only ugly." "Wickedness always is," said Miss Marple.
"Even when it borrows perfume." The girl looked at her reflection one last time.
"Will they hang me?" Miss Marple hesitated, then said softly, "No, child. They will pity you first. That is worse." Outside, the frost gleamed like powdered glass. Inside, the candle on the table flickered once and steadied, as if even flame were weary of deception. Chapter. The following day dawned pale and unsettled, a sky without conviction. Over St Mary Mead, the faint mist of scandal still hung, but it was thinning now, not because the village had grown charitable, but because it had grown curious. Curiosity is the disinfectant of gossip. It preserves where it cannot cleanse. Miss Marple, as ever, moved through the morning as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, her shawl pinned neatly and her knitting bag swinging like a conscience. But in her eyes, those pale blue eyes that missed nothing and forgave little, a private storm was brewing. Lettice Vale had confessed, yes, but confessions are like recipes passed down through families. They tend to omit the essential ingredient. Inspector Slack was jubilant. "It's a clear case," he announced to Dr. Haydock, who had joined him for coffee at the vicarage. Girl admits to pouring a drop of poison from her fancy pin into the sauce. Motive, means, opportunity, the Holy Trinity. She'll plead guilty, and we'll all be back to our business by Sunday. Dr. Haydock stirred his coffee gloomily. "It's too tidy. I don't like tidy crimes. They're like tidy patients. They die unexpectedly." Miss Marple, who had appeared without fanfare, set down a small tin of shortbread. "Quite so, Doctor. Crimes, like puddings, are seldom perfect when too smooth," Slack groaned.
"Not again."
"You've solved it already, haven't you?" "You always look like that before you drop the curtain." Miss Marple smiled. "Dear Inspector, if I drop the curtain, it will be only to show what's behind it. I think Miss Vale told the truth as far as she knew it, which is to say, not very far." That afternoon, Dr. Haydock's laboratory in Much Benham hummed with quiet efficiency. The sauce remnants, the tin labelled mace, and the hollow hatpin were laid before him like relics. Miss Marple, perched primly on a stool, watched as he poured and tested and measured, his hands steady as faith. "It's as we thought," he said. "The sauce contains hydrocyanic traces, certainly."
"But the pin," he held it up to the light, "empty."
"Not a grain of residue," Miss Marple inclined her head. And yet Lettice described the pour in such detail.
"Fascinating, isn't it, how people can remember things that never happened?"
Haydock frowned.
"Do you think someone used a decoy?"
"Perhaps," she said softly. "Someone clever enough to know that the only thing stronger than guilt is the need to confess." He set down the pin. "Who then?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A woman who has made a lifetime of stirring, sources, secrets, and funds. A woman who feared exposure not for theft but for pride." That evening, Miss Marple called at the vicarage. Mrs. Grimsby received her in a sitting-room stripped of comfort, the curtains drawn though daylight lingered. The woman's face was a study in fatigue, proud bones, tremulous hands and eyes that avoided kindness. "I suppose you've come to ask whether I stole from the fund," she said. "Everyone else has." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "My dear, I've come to ask whether you stole from yourself." Mrs. Grimsby blinked.
I don't understand." "Pride," said Miss Marple softly.
"You allowed Mr. Pinsent to keep the fund account under his control, even when it troubled you. And when a small discrepancy appeared, likely his clerk's error, you repaid it yourself, didn't you?"
"Secretly from your housekeeping." The woman's lips trembled. I couldn't bear for the church to think me careless. I meant to tell him.
But he laughed when I asked for the books, said women shouldn't dabble in figures. Chapter. The following morning came grey and fine-edged, as though the sky itself were holding its breath. The frost had hardened into a glassy stillness, and the hedges wore the look of confession, stripped and shivering, unable to pretend. St Mary Mead was quiet, but not with peace, rather with the delicate hush that precedes a verdict. Mrs. Grimsby had been taken to Much Benham under constable's escort. Lettice Vale, chastened but not entirely cured of self-regard, had gone to stay with an aunt in Bath for her nerves. Ellen was back at the vicarage, pale and aimless, moving like a ghost that tidies even in death. And Miss Marple, that small and indomitable guardian of human frailty, sat by her fire, knitting in silence. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, pacing a narrow corridor between what was known, what was believed, and what was true, because something still whispered, too neat, too gentle, too wrong. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Slack arrived, not triumphant this time, but uncertain. He had the look of a man who had caught a fish too easily, and now suspects it may be the bait. "Well," he said, removing his hat, "it's all squared away, on paper at least. Mrs. Grimsby's confession matches the facts. She admits she mistook the bottle, thought it was spice, says the smell frightened her, but she'd already stirred it into the sauce. She broke down crying halfway through. The crown'll go soft on her, mark my words. Manslaughter, if that." Miss Marple poured tea, the comfort of the guilty and innocent alike. "You're not satisfied, Inspector?" Slack frowned into his cup. "It fits. It all fits. Only—" "Yes?" "She said she took the tin before supper began. That can't be right. The pudding wasn't even plated yet. Ellen swears the tin was on the shelf when she fetched the nutmeg later that afternoon. Someone's lying, or remembering convenient." Miss Marple nodded. "Ah, the difference between before and just before on a whole world can fit into those two words." He gave her a sharp look. "You think someone helped her, or used her?" "I think," she said softly, "someone expected her mistake, and counted upon it." After luncheon, Miss Marple put on her thickest coat and set out toward the Blue Boar. The tavern, always receptive to rumour, was already busy with midday idlers who found ale steadier than morals. She asked for cider and took her place near the fire. Her ears, sharper than most people's eyes, did the rest, said the Major warned him. "Weeks ago," muttered one farmer. "Pinsent was meddling with the parish boundary papers. Major said he'd settle it man to man." "Aye," said another, "and the Major's shed smells of paraffin and temper."
Never a safe mix. Miss Marple sipped her cider, thoughtful. She had not liked the set of Major Goodenough's mouth when Mrs. Grimsby's confession was read aloud. Relief, yes, but also the tightness of a man who hears an unexpected reprieve,
and wonders if the hangman's rope might still be coiled in reserve. She left quietly, her cane tapping the frozen ground. The Major was in his garden, hacking at a rosebush as if it had insulted him. His breath steamed in the cold, his moustache, that martial banner, bristled at her approach. "Miss Marple," he said curtly, "come to see the criminal's handiwork. Dashed nuisance, all of it."
"Ruined the parish reputation." "I came," said Miss Marple, to return this." She held out a folded scrap of paper, the letter she had taken from Pinsent's desk. The Major took it automatically, then paled. "Where did you—" "Good Lord."
"It was in Mr. Pinsent's private drawer. I thought you might like to see the back." He turned it over. Scrawled faintly in pencil were the words, "For good enough. Lane boundary dispute." Miss Marple watched his fingers tighten. It seems Mr. Pinsent had writ chapter. It was 3 days later when Miss Marple received the letter that drew the final veil aside. A thin envelope addressed in a trembling, careful hand. From Much Benham Police Station. Inside a single page. "Dear Miss Marple," Ellen passed quietly in the night. Pneumonia, they think. She had been very still since the confession, neither fighting nor yielding, merely waiting. She left no statement, only a small prayer book and a folded note addressed to you. Inspector Slack. Miss Marple sat very still, the paper trembling faintly in her hand. Then she opened the smaller envelope enclosed within. "Dear Miss Marple, you were right. It was love and pride together that did it. I thought I could stop pain with one small drop.
I thought God would understand.
But he sent you instead. Please tell Mrs. Grimsby I meant no harm, and tell the Major I forgive him for shouting when I spilt the milk that day."
"He never meant unkindness. I remember your roses in spring. I shall think of them."
"Your friend, Ellen." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, the way one folds a child's drawing, as something imperfect and beloved. She set it beside her teacup and looked toward the window, where a pale winter sun struggled through the glass. By order of Inspector Slack, more from habit than necessity, a final inquest was convened in the parish hall. There was nothing to discover, yet the act itself seemed to soothe St Mary Mead, which had grown restless with the burden of knowing. The hall looked smaller now, stripped of its banners and laughter. The same table stood in the centre, scrubbed clean of sweat and gilt. On it lay a single white cloth, and in its centre, a candle. Mrs. Grimsby sat quietly in the front row, her hands clasped, her eyes hollow. Major Whodunit, rigid, with awkward decency, occupied a corner, his hat gripped like a promise. Dr. Haydock, ever sardonic, leaned against the wall, arms folded. Slack presided, his tone brisk, his discomfort hidden beneath the business of procedure. Miss Marple, uninvited but unrepelled, sat near the back, her knitting in her lap.
Her eyes on the flame. The formalities past. Medical statements.
Timing Ellen's confession read in a steady voice that faltered only once. And then, when silence fell and the officials turned to each other with the mild satisfaction of men concluding paperwork, Miss Marple rose. "Forgive me, Inspector," she said softly, "but there is still something to be said." Slack sighed, resigned.
Go on, Miss Marple."
"It's your village, after all." She stepped forward, the candlelight touching the silver in her hair. "You have heard how Ellen changed the tins. You have heard how Mrs. Grimsby poured from what she believed was spice. And you have heard how poor Mr. Pinsent died of pride and pudding. But I think you have not yet understood how well it was planned." A murmur ran through the room. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "Ellen did not stumble upon the poison by chance. The tin was not merely mislabeled. It was prepared, placed where she would find it, and marked by a hand that knew she could not resist helping her mistress. That hand did not belong to Mrs. Grimsby. It did not belong to Ellen. It belonged to the one man in this village who understood opportunity as a soldier. Understands terrain. Major Whodunit." The Major sprang to his feet.
"Madam, that's outrageous." "Is it?" she asked gently.
"You quarrelled with Mr. Pinsent. You knew he meant to expose your boundary deceit." "Yes, Inspector. I have seen the letter in his files, written the week before his death." "You also knew Mrs. Grimsby's kitchen, for you were courting her once upon a time before your pride made you retreat. It was easy to know where she kept her spices, easier still to exploit the loyalty of her maid. You brought that tin,
Major, the old chemist's relic, and left it for Ellen to mistake, knowing she would.
knowing her eagerness to shield her mistress. The room had gone very still. Miss Marple's voice softened. You counted on her ignorance, on Mrs. Grimsby's shame, and on the world's willingness to believe that women poison and men merely lose their tempers. You wanted Pinsent silenced, and you let 2 women carry your sin. Slack's pen hovered, unmoving. Can you prove that, Miss Marple? She reached into her bag and drew out a small object wrapped in paper. Yes, the real tin of nutmeg found yesterday when the church cleaner dusted behind the hymn cupboard. The label is in the Major's hand, the same neat capitals he used in his army reports. He replaced the jar after Ellen left, certain that no one would question a missing spice once the pudding was gone. The Major's face had gone a colour between clay and fear. You can't, you've no right. Truth, Miss Marple said quietly, has every right. There was no struggle.
Only silence, the kind that follows a shot at dawn.
The Major's shoulders slumped, his moustache wilted into age. I didn't mean, he muttered. It was to frighten him, to make him yield the land. He was ruining everything.
I thought, yes, Miss Marple said sadly.
You thought it would be simple. One little mistake and no one would ever look your way. But wickedness, like pudding, has a way of swelling beyond its dish. He sat,
hands over his face. Slack nodded once to his constable.
And the formality of arrest was performed. Quiet, efficient, almost merciful. When all was done, the villagers filed out slowly as from a funeral. Mrs. Grimsby paused beside Miss Marple. You've given me back my life, she said faintly. Miss Marple smiled. My dear, lives are never lost, only mislaid. Outside, the frost had melted into soft, clean mud. The first birds of early spring were testing their songs in cautious half-notes. Dr. Haydock came up beside her. You're a terror, Jane. Every time I think the book's closed, you scribble another chapter. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. The truth always writes itself, Doctor. We merely hold the pen steady. That night she sat alone in her parlour, the letter from Ellen beside the candle. She read it once more, her lips moving silently on the line. I thought God would understand. Then she whispered, He does, my dear. He does. The candle burned lower, the shadows lengthened. Outside, the wind carried the faintest smell of wood smoke and wet earth, the scent of endings turning into beginnings. And as Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her eyes half closed, she murmured, as though to the flame itself. In every crime, there is a moment when kindness might have saved a soul. It is our misfortune that we so seldom notice it in time. The candle flickered once, then steadied. A small light. Unafraid of darkness, Miss Marple's reflection. The days that followed settled over St Mary Mead with a stillness that was neither peace nor mourning, but something in between. The quiet a village keeps when it has run out of things to say aloud. By the time crocuses appeared in the churchyard, the story of the poison pudding had already begun its transformation into folklore. Some said it was pride that killed Mr. Pinsent, others the Restoration Fund's curse, and a few, more poetic, whispered that it was the Sunday pudding itself, jealous of its own perfection. But Miss Marple, who had seen too many tragedies reborn as parables, knew better. She sat one evening by her fire, a cup of cocoa at her side, the knitting folded neatly beside her. The candle burned low, steady as a heart that has known both justice and pity. Her diary, a plain brown book without sentiment, lay open. In a fine slanting hand she wrote, It is never the act alone that condemns, but the thought that justifies it. Ellen believed herself righteous. Mrs. Grimsby believed herself shamed. Major Goodenough believed himself clever. Between them, a man died who had no poetry in him, but enough vanity to make him the perfect sacrifice. Human beings are like puddings, some too rich, some underdone, most over-sweetened by their own excuses, and yet I find myself loving them all the more for it. I sometimes think of Ellen, whose heart was too kind to stay clean, and of Mrs. Grimsby, who prayed to be forgiven for sins she never truly committed. They were both good women, and goodness, I've learned, is rarely safe. As for the Major, he will spend his remaining years in a place where silence is enforced, an ironic penance for a man who once commanded so many words.
I do not rejoice in it.
Punishment is rarely satisfying.
One cannot knit a dropped stitch back into the pattern.
One can only finish the row and make the next neater. Justice, when it comes, is not thunder. It is the small click of truth finding its place. She paused, dipped her pen once more, and continued in a softer script, almost a whisper to herself. Sometimes, late at night, I think of that Sunday. The warm pudding, the candlelight trembling over white plates, the brief moment before a man raised his spoon and altered all our lives. I wonder if, had I spoken earlier, had I been less polite, I might have changed something. But one cannot live among one's neighbours and interrupt every tragedy at the doorway. One would be most unpopular. A village, like a conscience, must keep its own secrets, until it cannot. She closed the book, laid her pen aside, and looked at the candle. The flame curved briefly as if listening, and as the candle burned low, another secret met its shadow. Candlelight Mysteries channel message. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Candlelight Mysteries, where every secret is revealed by the soft glow of candlelight. Each week, another tale of quiet deceit and tender justice awaits you, from lonely manors to sleeping villages, from whispered letters to poisoned puddings, in the company of Miss Marple, Hercule Poirot, and all our beloved sleuths. Remember, it is not the darkness that hides the truth. It is the comfort of the familiar. Another secret fades. By candlelight. End of story. Miss Marple and the Poison in the Sunday Pudding. A Candlelight Mysteries original.